Okay, let's get started here. This is, I would say we're especially pleased to have our next speaker join us as our featured speaker for day one. In past years, we've generally pursued agenda topics that were not Houston-centric, really thinking about the number of attendees we have coming in from other parts of Texas. Think San Antonio, think Austin, think Dallas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, New York, Colorado. And so we've really wanted to have a non-Houston-centric kind of program. But following 2017, thinking about those amazing Astros, right? Please, to all Astros fans. And as well as that storm called Harvey, we thought that 2018 was one year where it might make sense to focus a little bit on what's going on in Houston and where are we headed. So when we thought about that, we really could think of no one better than our next speaker to have that mission. For in truth, there really is an awful lot of energy and excitement going on in Houston right now, really with driving a vision and building a path for the next generation for where this city will be, the fourth largest city in the U.S. Bob is in the middle of much of that. So we invited Bob Harvey to be our featured speaker for day one. I think as many of you know, Bob has served as president and CEO of the Greater Houston Partnership since September 2012. For those less familiar, the GHP, as it's routinely called around here, is the preeminent economic development organization serving the Greater Houston area. Its membership includes leaders from 1,200 local companies and organizations. So it really represents the full breadth of what I would call the Greater Houston corporate community. That's how you could think about it. Bob was raised here in Houston. He is a proud Aggie, right?
There's no other kind.
Right, there's no other kind. He went on to receive his MBA from Harvard. He worked at McKinsey & Company here in Houston for 17 years before serving as vice chairman with Reliant Energy. So please join me in providing a warm welcome to Bob. And as he's getting up and getting ready to get started, I would remind everyone, as you have questions, write them down on the cards, hold them up. We'll get them and then feed them to Bob as he gets going. So we'd love to get your questions for Bob. So Bob, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bill. And they promised me that they would not open the bar until I was finished. I'm just telling you that in case you're inclined to slip out in a few minutes, but we'll see. Thank you for this opportunity. As Bill said, I am a native Houstonian. I am going to frame this conversation around what's happening in Houston, but there may be some threads that are of interest, just as in the panel you just heard from. These aren't just Houston topics we're talking about. They're broad metro topics in many cases, so I'm pleased to get a chance to speak to you all. Just another word or two on the partnership. Houston is unique in the sense that we have one organization that is both the Chamber of Commerce and the Economic Development Association, and in our case, the third thing, the World Trade Council. All three of those groups merged in 1989. I think some people with some real foresight in Houston said we ought to have one organization doing all these things. And so we've operated in that mode now for 29 years. And one or two cities around the country have followed suit, but in most major metros, you still have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different competing organizations. So in Houston, we can bring the whole community together to talk about policy issues, economic development issues, quality of life issues, all of which are interrelated these days. So it really works well that we have this structure. So I'm going to kind of give you just a short summary. Let me start. Houston, I don't know a better phrase. Houston is doing pretty well. Pretty well. That can. Here, let me. I'll just put it right there. Thank you. Pretty well for Houston means that we added about 45,000 jobs in Houston last year. Average for Houston is more like 60,000. And in a really good year, we add 120,000. We added 120,000 back in 14, just as things began to turn. So we're not back up to a level that we would consider normal or average or satisfactory, but we're moving in the right direction. We absorbed the drop in oil prices without having a year-to-year drop in employment in Houston. In the worst year, 15, we still added, thank goodness, 200 jobs across the region. I'm so proud of those 200 people. I want to go out and hug them. And I don't want the government to revise that data ever, because I'm very pleased with that. Compare that to the 80s, when Houston lost 1 out of 7 jobs in aggregate in the mid-'80s. So we just absorbed a pretty remarkable drop in oil prices, a remarkable drop in the rig count, but by and large stayed flat for a year and then began a gradual growth. And as we tend to say at the partnership these days, in a bad year, Houston grows slowly, and in a good year, we grow very fast. And we are very much a growth community. It's just kind of who we are. People are moving to Houston in good times and in bad times and what have you. Of course, that also speaks to the fact that our economy has diversified a lot since the 80s. We often say that, but this was a real test of that. But I also remind people that we still have a huge concentration and a huge dependence on energy. I was very pleased again at that last panel, and I'll come back to this topic of new energy because it's so important today that we begin to expand our definition of energy to get beyond traditional oil and gas. So in that respect, our economy is starting to pick up. Our forecast for this year at the partnership is that we'll add roughly another 45,000 jobs in aggregate. But frankly, oil prices are a little bit higher than we premised that scenario on. So, we should be more moving back in the 50 to 60,000 range if things continue to move. So all in all, I think, we're able to think about the city, think about the strategy from the standpoint of things are okay, but they could be better. So I want to talk about, I'm going to say 5 things, and we may not get to all 5. 5 issues that we're wrestling with now at the partnership. You could call them issues, you could call them opportunities, but they're 5 important topics that we're spending time with. And the first of which is so obvious, I don't hardly have to say it. We probably need to do something about our flood mitigation in Houston. People ask me, what has been the effect of Harvey, the hurricane, on our economy, on prospecting for major employers to move to Houston? And I would say, with a couple of exceptions where we've heard reference to the flooding, I think the perception that has developed in the months following Harvey are 2-part. One is our city demonstrated some attributes that the rest of the country and the rest of the world found to be pretty positive, pretty remarkable. What they saw happening in Houston immediately post-flood, that self-initiated, ground-up, neighbor-helping-neighbor response to the storm was frankly not something they had seen in other recent natural disasters around the country. So oddly enough, the immediate impression we had and what we heard from people were the most extreme quote, which I love to use, is, "I saw in Houston the workforce I wish I had." So people saw something in Houston that was truly unique. Frankly, they also saw our leadership, our mayor, our county judge, our governor, more or less being on the same page. At least the judge and the mayor particularly were on the same page during those critical days. And again, contrast that with some of the other natural disasters around the country. But what's happened since is also a recognition with other stories around the country and around the world is this issue of flooding is not an issue unique to Houston. It's an issue now all coastal communities are reckoning with and developing plans for. Ours was extreme, but then again, 51 inches of rain is extreme, and people recognize that. So they don't think that was anything normal, anything necessarily to be repeated. Obviously, they do realize that Houston is facing what we call riverine flooding, which is what, when the creek comes out of the banks, we have real issues there. So our response to that, and I think people are believing it, is that Houston will also be the first major metro that addresses this issue, which is now common to all coastal communities. You'll see us taking steps to improve our flood mitigation capacity or to improve our conveyance capacity is the term the engineers use on our creeks. The first big step in that, you could say it was the second. We had an appropriation right after the storm, but I'll call it the first big step in that was the federal appropriation that was agreed to now several weeks ago. Let me see if it comes back. If not, I'm not going to move around much if we want to move to this mic. Let's try that. How's that? All right. So that federal appropriation is going to start a process in Houston now of determining how do we really intend to spend that money and whose interests are going to be met in that process. And I mean that in a legitimate sense. There are a lot of community interests that will be impacted by how we spend this money. So I would tell the Houstonians, don't think that federal appropriation was the end of anything. It was really the beginning of a community-wide discussion as to how we intend to spend this money. How do we intend to deal with flood mitigation? How do we intend to change our community for the better as much as possible for everyone concerned? Now, I'll give you a case in point. I mean, it's easy to talk about expanding the conveyance capacity of a bayou by buying the adjacent acreage along the bayou and expanding the bayou, but you may have just taken out an apartment complex or housing that some community was depending upon. So if you don't think through these issues and think about the unintended consequences or the secondary implications of this, then you're going to miss some real issues and real opportunities. So we anticipate that the next few months, frankly, the next few years are going to be spent here in Houston deciding how best to move forward. It'll be a test of our civic cohesion in some ways as much or more than the immediate aftermath of the storm, all right, because various interests will come to the table. So we'll be dealing with that. But my commitment to the community and our commitment as the partnership is to be a convening body that brings the parties to the table so that we can move this city forward and make these improvements. We estimated at the partnership that to take every bayou in Houston up to a 100-year flood standard, or a 1% flood standard as we say today, or a 12 inches of rain per day standard, would take about $54 billion. We didn't get $54 billion, so we got about $20 billion we think is likely to be heading to Houston for resilience. So we also need to figure out which of those projects that we had talked about are really the most important and move that issue forward. But we'll be doing that, and I think as we do that, I think our standing around the business world in the U.S. and internationally will recover fairly quickly. It may have recovered already. I think people by and large accept the fact that we're going to take the steps we need to take in Houston to deal with flood mitigation. And since I've talked about riverine flooding, I should mention surge protection, coastal surge protection, the Ike Dike or the coastal spine. That issue is also being addressed, or we hope it will be addressed, but again, there's some debate about how much federal money in this latest appropriation will actually go to that purpose. But throughout this process, even though storm surge was not the issue in Hurricane Harvey, we do recognize that had a storm like Ike moved slightly differently, we would have had incredible damage on the ship channel. So we need to be thinking riverine flooding and storm surge and acting accordingly. So, in some respects, infrastructure, I'm a mechanical engineer by degree. I can think of this effort moving forward, bringing in alternate views, building consensus. I can see a path through that. The second issue I would put forward for Houston is much more complex, and that's the issue of education, public education, but really education generally in Houston. You may have, if you were sitting here this afternoon, you might not have seen the announcement that Richard Carranza, the superintendent of HISD, has resigned and is heading to New York to lead the schools in New York City. That's remarkable at many levels. He's only been here about 18 months, but if you've been following the media reports on HISD and the behavior at the board level, and you were thinking if I was Richard, I would have perhaps found a plane to New York. And so that's just indicative of an issue. The broader issue in Houston is that as a community, we depend very, very heavily on importing talent in a manner that is not healthy for a major metro. Two thoughts about Houston when it comes to baccalaureate degreed talent. Houston produces fewer baccalaureate degrees per capita than any other top 10 metro in the country. So we simply don't produce as many here in Houston as other major metros. We offset that. We import more baccalaureate degreed professionals per capita than any other top 10 metro in the country. So we make it balanced, and we have a lot of college-educated talent in Houston, and fortunately Houston has been an attractive place for young millennial talent to go, thanks to the quality of life improvements and the strength of our economy. But that model of basically importing talent, the obvious implication of that is that you have a community of local citizens, local residents then who are not progressing up into the economy as they would like to. So the statistic for Houston you may have heard is that only 20% of our young people are completing any form of post-secondary credential by the age of 24. 20% are getting any form of post-secondary credential, a baccalaureate degree, an associate degree, or even a certificate from a community college, 20%. So 80% of our young people are kind of entering the workforce without the skills, even for a middle school job, much less an upper skill job. So we see at the partnership a number of opportunities in this area to address education, one of which is early childhood. And people are always somewhat surprised when the partnership, a business group, is looking that far upstream and looking at birth to third grade and talking about whether our kids are progressing to being literate by the third grade. And we're saying that because the big discovery in education is that if you don't address these children from birth prior to them arriving in school, they don't develop intellectually, or the neuroscientists would say, their neurons, they don't develop in a fashion that allows them to be successful in school. And now the neuroscientists can literally show you images of young children's brains and showing how this child's brain developed this way and this child's brain developed that way. And what they're basically saying is that environment that that young infant lives in is what's determining their ability, their cognitive skills, and by implication, their social skills that allows them to be successful when they enter school. So we're spending a lot of time in Houston talking about what can we do to help these children be in better environments. Better environments means largely, besides just being nurturing, where they hear more language spoken to them. We always say, talk to your children, sing to your children, read to your children. They develop not just the vocabulary and ultimately the ability to read. Their whole intellectual development depends on that interaction as a young person before age 5. So we're spending time on early childhood. At the other end, we're spending time on middle skill workers, which is to say, how do we get our young people to recognize that you can be successful in this world without a baccalaureate degree? We say it this way: success does not require a 4-year degree. And I always like saying that in front of audiences like this, because if there's a group that is probably steeped in this tradition that success does require a 4-year degree, it's probably a group like this, right? We all want our children to have a 4-year degree. Some of us have a hard time imagining, what would life be like without a 4-year degree. But the facts of the matter are, I mentioned earlier that 20% of our young people are completing a post-secondary credential. Well, guess what? 20% of our young people test as being college ready by their junior year of high school. Not coincidentally, right? Unfortunately, 50% of our kids go off to college, and so 20% of our kids graduate, so that 30% in the middle there, they're incurring debt, they're failing in their mind in college, and we're trying to convince young people that maybe they ought to think about their aptitudes and interests and think about how they gain the skills to have a very successful life and career that may not preclude going back to college at some point when they're ready and being successful. So we have a program we call Upskill Houston here in Houston, which has proven to be, I think, very successful at drawing the community colleges, the employers, the school districts all to the table to talk about that. And I can't the real issue now, we realize, is K through 12 public education in Houston. So I talked about early childhood, talked about the other end, the middle school issue. But now we're in the midst of discussions on fundamental school reform. And I'm really not going to go there because you could spend an whole evening talking about this. For those of you here in Houston, or those of you perhaps from Dallas, we have just formed an organization in Houston to look at what's called cradle to career, look at from birth to entering the workforce, with a focus on K through 12, a focus on that middle segment. And how do we achieve fundamental reform in our schools? Patterned after an effort in Dallas. The reason I make reference to Dallas is Dallas formed an organization called Commit Partnership, which has achieved incredible things in terms of moving the needle on the measures of academic success in DISD, the Dallas School District. And we used to say in Houston, no matter what you could say bad about HISD, you could at least show a chart that showed it was better than DISD. And for those of you from Houston, know you can almost succeed in life as long as you can make favorable comparisons to Dallas. But actually, that's no longer the case. The Commit effort in Dallas has moved the needle far enough on DISD, and now they've expanded it out to the county. They've brought Fort Worth into it. So there is a model of using data and engaging the superintendents, the principals, and the teachers with a discussion about what works in public education, how do we bring those practices to bear, how do we move the needle. So we're going to be talking about that a lot in Houston in the coming months. But until then, we need to keep HISD together, and I won't go far this direction, but some of you know that there are 10 schools in HISD that are facing the possibility of being judged improvement required, IR, at the end of this year for the 5th consecutive year. And under state law, if a school district has even one school that is IR for 5 consecutive years, there's 3 choices. They either shut the school, they partner with someone to come in and operate the school, or the third option is that the state takes over the school board for the entire district. So as early as August 15th of this year, we face the potential of the state education commissioner appointing a board of managers to run HISD. Now that's not good from an economic development standpoint. It's not a great message to carry around the country, but I think right now in Houston, for the first time I've seen, there are people who are actually asking the question whether that might not be the right answer for HISD, appointing a board of managers to literally take over the governance of the school district. We're not there yet, and the commissioner has not said he's going to take that action, but it's certainly possible. So let me move to number 3. Energy, you've heard a lot about today, your 2 previous panels. Let me just kind of reinforce and then I'll move on. For us to stay competitive in fossil fuels, the bread and butter of Houston, oil and gas, means we have to evolve to an increasingly digital environment for oil and gas. If you had a child, and I don't, and some of you might, so I don't want to be too glib about this. If your child was going off to college to study petroleum engineering, thinking that the fossil fuel industry was going to provide the same kind of career that it might have provided my generation, I think you could have a real debate today as to whether that's true. Half of my board is made up of members of the oil and gas industry, so I don't want to be quoted saying that that's at risk. But what's happening within oil and gas is that the digital fields are actually supplanting the traditional STEM or engineering fields. So it's the subtlety I would be pointing out is that this issue of whether it's in the industrial Internet of Things or machine learning or artificial intelligence or big data, all these topics that come together to be called digital technology, the industry is transforming itself so quickly that we're still seeing layoffs today among the oil companies. The big operators are still laying off. Even though the rig count has come up a fair bit, the economics have improved substantially because they're still trying to find the right balance between the traditional skill sets that they have plenty of and the new skill sets that they're going to need in the future. And I would characterize that as this shift towards a more digital skill set. And that's whether it's a computer science major, a math major, a statistics major, a whole set of fields that kind of fall under this heading of digital science. You heard about alternate energy, or what we're calling new energy now at the partnership. It is coming on much faster than we would have anticipated a few years ago. Fortunately, there are companies in Houston, and you were hearing from some of them today, who are heavily invested in this new energy field, and big oil is investing heavily in new energy. Some of them are doing it quietly, some of them are doing it very openly. But this transition from a fossil world, an oil and gas world, to a new energy world, alternate energy, power-based, battery-based, is occurring very rapidly. And it's changing everyone's thinking about the economics of investments even today. Fortunately, I think in Houston we have a strong standing in new energy, but it's somewhat hidden by our reputation as being the home of the traditional oil and gas industry. So we're thinking about how do we position ourselves better when it comes to that. The fourth area I would mention is life sciences. If you want to talk about Houston today, what you would say is energy has been our traditional strength. We've always had a strong medical center. What we're now realizing is that medical center, if it evolves in a certain fashion, could be a key driver of the Houston economy going forward. We have the largest medical center in the world. It is largely a clinical facility, meaning people in beds. It's largely a research and education facility. What it has not been is a commercial facility, a place where research was developed into products, whether they be therapies or diagnostic techniques that can be commercialized. So there's a very substantial effort underway today to transform our medical center into that more commercial enterprise. Now, you've heard about TMCX, which is the accelerator, if you will, operating at TMC. You've heard of J Labs, J&J's presence there, J&J Medical Devices, which is a separate unit, the AT&T Foundry. We're doing the things we need to be doing, but the thing we must do now is advance this idea of TMC3. Those of you in Houston have heard reference to TMC3, which would be the four of the leading institutions in the medical center coming together to build a commercial facility, a commercialization facility that they would all share and all use. That would be the thing that would advance our medical center to being world-class when it comes to commercialization. The rest of the world is kind of waiting whether we're going to deliver on TMC3. We've been talking about it for a couple of years, and my message to Houstonians is we must get behind TMC3, which is moving all those four institutions together at the same time to sign up. But the last topic I want to mention is just this broad topic of innovation. People ask me a lot, why did Houston lose the Amazon? We did not advance to the second round of Amazon. I can almost say that now without tearing up. It's been a few weeks, right? We're the largest city in the country that did not advance to the second round. That hurts. But what I would tell you is every indication prior to Amazon's decision, every major article that was written around the U.S., everyone's attempt to rank the cities, prognosticators were trying to suggest which cities might be in the top 10 or top 20. Houston was not in the top 20 of any of those stories. We were seeing plenty of evidence that there was an issue. The issue was not our quality of life. Our quality of life in Houston was quite competitive. Every metric we see shows us there. It wasn't our transit system. Some people have suggested that, but when you look at the cities that made it into the top 20, half of them have no transit whatsoever. It wasn't transit, and we centered our proposal around the transit assets we have, which are along Main Street, as you know. The issue was our digital workforce per Amazon was simply not competitive with the cities, the other cities that they were looking at. They told that to us. They've told that to a couple of the other cities that expected to be in the second round. Minneapolis didn't make it. Big surprise that they didn't make it. Detroit didn't make it. Maybe not as big a surprise, even though a lot of good things are happening in Detroit these days. So we went back and did an analysis, and we looked at the number of digital tech workers. And there are 5 or 6 categories, degrees that would count as a digital tech worker. But I mentioned earlier, computer science professional, computer engineer, software engineer, a statistician, applied math major, a set of fields that are generally put in this setting. Every city that had over 100,000 such people made it into the top 20. And every city that had and I don't know the stat, I should have written it down. Every city that had a concentration of such people above a certain level made it into the top 20. And Houston had neither. We had neither the absolute number of digital tech employees nor the concentration. A city like a city like Austin, actually they fare pretty well on both, but mainly they fare well on the concentration. So what we heard from Amazon, and they called and they talked, they weren't being opaque. They said, what you have in Houston in terms of a lot of these features is fine. What you say you're doing in terms of building a digital economy is perfect. And if we were making this decision 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, after you've done all those things, yeah, you would be there with in the top of the group. But sitting here today, making our decision today, we don't think you have and they would add the word millennial. They would say millennial digital tech workforce. That's their full-length phrase for what they're looking for. And so what we realize in Houston is we have a digital workforce, but it's largely embedded in our energy companies, our big operators, our service companies, and so it's not very visible to them, and they don't think they can come to Houston and really compete for that talent. The oil industry on a good day can pay whatever it has to pay, and they don't think they can easily attract millennial digital talent to Houston. So our message has been back to everyone in Houston, beginning with the universities, but others, is that we need to get behind these efforts in Houston to create this new digital economy. How do you do that? You do it by supporting the startups. You create a more healthy innovation ecosystem for disruptive startups, VC-backed startups, that today are largely digital. And that's the kind of ecosystem, that's the kind of environment that attracts these millennials. We need to talk to our universities about enhancing their academic programs in these areas. And we need to do what we could have done a year ago around the UT proposal for a data science institute. What we would say at the partnership, we need to form a Houston Data Science Institute to pull our big data skills together. And it needs to involve all the major universities, not just the University of Texas, as had been proposed. But we need to do all those things if Houston is to be competitive. So we're doing the other things that are required. We have reconstructed our core innovation hub, which used to be the Houston Technology Center. The HTC arguably had somewhat not kept up with the evolution in this space. We created a new organization called Houston Exponential. Houston Exponential has formed a venture capital fund. You've probably read one or two articles about it, called the HX Venture Fund, which is going to be a fund of funds to help bring more VC capital to Houston and bring VC interest to Houston, get them to come look at our companies. We're taking other steps to create more of a density, a concentration of this activity in Midtown that we're now calling the Innovation Corridor. So we're trying to do all those things to kind of create a more healthy innovation ecosystem in Houston. But I'll just say we have a ways to go. And thinking of this audience, one of the biggest problems we face in Houston is that if you look at where private capital goes in Houston, that which doesn't go to public company investment, traditional portfolios, that which goes into private investments, about 99% of it goes into private equity, largely energy-based private equity, and about 1% of it goes into venture capital. And part of our message to Houstonians is, though we have a history of being comfortable with energy investing, and we've gotten comfortable with private equity energy investing. We were all in drilling funds 20 years ago. We've been in private equity funds that probably did better than our drilling funds, hopefully. But we need to get people to consider various mechanisms whereby Houstonians can invest in VC. We have to create a more vibrant venture capital economy here in Houston. Some of that involves bringing the big VC firms to Houston, but some of that involves getting Houstonians to think harder about participating with quality programs in the VC space. So it's that last one that keeps me up at night. This issue of, Houston, I got out of school 40 years ago, went into the oil patch. Houston has had various ups and downs, some more extreme than others. But throughout that period, it seemed like we had the core economic engines to drive our economy forward. Today, I would say, and I'll say it in this audience, I don't say this everywhere, if we don't find a way to take our life science strength and move it towards this more commercial model, and if we don't find a way to take our traditional energy and manufacturing economy and convert it to this more digital energy and manufacturing economy, we could be looking back in Houston 10 or 20 years from now and asking ourselves, where did we miss the turn in the road? And so my message to Houstonians is we need to be paying careful attention to these rapidly evolving changes, not just in the U.S. economy, but the world economy. And in the context of this afternoon, around what's happening in energy and what's happening with digital technology of all sorts. We have to make that transition and make it successfully to compete. So I should probably end with some positive news. That's a pretty down. But I mean, I'm not convinced at all that we can't do it. All the great minds in Houston, I think, are pretty much on the same page on this point. This is what we need to do. But we have to do it. We can't just talk about it. We have to do it. And if the Amazon failure wasn't, if it was anything, it should have been seen as a wake-up call for Houston to figure out what is it that's changing in the U.S. economy that would leave the fourth largest city out of that process. All right, thank you.
Good. I expect we will have some questions. So raise your cards, people pick it up. But let me just throw in one to get started. You mentioned the Data Science Institute, what I call version 1, which stopped, and now there's a version 2 that is developing that would be tied to local institutions. Talk a little bit more about what you see to be the outlook for that, hurdle points for it, likelihood that it'll come together.
Okay. I'll repeat the story because I'll then frame what's different against that story. So the University of Texas buys 300 acres in Houston. Now, a quick aside, I'm an Aggie, and even I celebrated the notion that the University of Texas system acquired 300 acres in Houston. How do you look at your premier flagship system, their decision to move into your metro, and not applaud? Now, obviously, some in the community don't agree with me on that, and so it wasn't a universal round of applause. So they form a task force, they look at what they're going to do with that land, and they conclude, after a lot of work, over about 6 months, that the best thing they could do with that land is form this Data Science Institute. They called it the UT Data Science Institute. And they went out and looked at what was happening with big data, what was happening in energy and in life science with respect to big data, and said, Houston has an opportunity. We have these incredible data sets around energy and medicine. We have these incredible data sets. We have a lot of smart data science people embedded in these companies. What if we could pull all that together and pull our academic institutions into that mix and create a kind of a leading edge collaborative for sharing technology, problem sets, approaches, as much as you can across industry and academic boundaries. So what we've gone back to, we went back to the industry and said, if we're going to resurrect this idea, we need industry to be out in front. This can't be owned or led so much by the academic institutions that it looks like an academic initiative. So we've gone back to the oil companies, gone back to the service companies, gone back to the key institutions at the medical center, all of whom have agreed that this is absolutely the right direction. It's critical for Houston. They're prepared to sit down. So now we're going back to the academic institutions and saying, all right, let's come back to the table. But oh, by the way, our view at the partnership is that A&M, UT, Rice, and UH should all be sitting at the table as academic institutions. So we need at least the collective horsepower of those 4 academic institutions to be successful. You all should know that all of this is happening on the West Coast and the East Coast. Our energy companies are big in data science. Guess where their data scientists are? They're in Silicon Valley or across the bay at San Ramon, or they're in Boston. So it's not like this isn't happening. It's not like this isn't needed. It's just not happening in Houston. And if we don't take some action, and we think this Data Science Institute is the best single action we could take to pull this back to Houston. So at this moment, I would say no, everyone's playing nice. I think everybody's moving in the right direction, but we haven't gotten it across the goal line.
Is it possible or likely that they'd wind up using, this could come together, the same plot of land that was gathered by UT on version 1?
Probably not.
Okay.
I said the group that's come back together has explicitly said we are land agnostic. In fact, we're at this point, we're saying we're physical manifestation agnostic. You've got to figure out what this thing is conceptually before you even think about what it needs in the way of a physical presence. So I think it's unlikely that it'll end up back on those 300 acres, and UT has made it clear that they intend to sell those acres, and they're actively attempting to do so.
Okay, we have some other questions. Your final comment, one of your later comments in your prepared remarks, seems to contradict your view that not everyone needs to go to college. Please clarify.
Well, that's a fair point. The Houston economy today and going forward, we think is going to have, I'll say 30 to 40% of the jobs will be jobs that require a baccalaureate education. We still think there are going to be jobs for technicians of all stripes that have a more mechanical orientation, a more electronic orientation. They are skilled workers who are evolving with technology. They're going to be, as people put it, they're going to be fixing the machines that are making the products. They're not going to be making the products. They're going to be working with the machines that make the products. So there are going to be opportunities for those kinds of workers. They do need to evolve through time. It's not going to be a static situation. Even in the middle skills, one's going to have to go get a credential. But 2 years later or 5 years later, they may be getting a new credential because this thing is evolving that rapidly. But we don't see a world where degreed professionals are 40, 50, 60% of the workforce. I mean, they're still going to be a modest percentage. But the rest of the workforce is going to need basic, you almost call them applied math skills, the kind of person that can solve a mechanical problem, has some sense has a spatial sense or a numeric sense about them, has good team skills, good communication skills, the kind of skills that you would say makes a worker, a quality worker, irrespective of their kind of their degree. So we're going to continue to need those.
Do you have a view for how much of that program development that's post K-12 but not baccalaureate needs to be funded and developed on the private side versus the public side? Do you have a view on that?
We need a couple of things. One is we need to shift our public dollars more towards this kind of activity. There's been debate about Pell Grants and how they can be made applicable to these kind of middle skill sets. So that needs to happen. Our public money needs to be better balanced between traditional baccalaureate degrees and others. But the private sector also has a role to play with respect to our apprenticeship programs, internships, union apprenticeship programs. All of those things are going to play a part. It's not just going to be in the school system. I would say one other thing. A lot of this needs to happen in high school, not in community college. So part of the transformation it sounds a little bit like we're going back to where we were 30 or 40 years ago. The difference today is we're not going to slot people, hopefully, based on our view of them. But we're going to give them options beginning in 9th grade so that they can pursue the pathway that they themselves choose.
There's definitely models of that in Germany in terms of how they've done it publicly and privately.
Absolutely. They've got the model, and we actually have brought Siemens and others to Houston to help explain that.
Okay, another question. I think we got time for a few more, I think. So keep feeding questions if you've got them. Could you give us your views on Houston financial issues? Think about pension liabilities and other related matters.
Well, we are extraordinarily pleased with what happened last year with respect to the city's pensions. I would argue we are the first major metro in the country to put in a long-term solution to the municipal pension problem among the top 10 cities. Now, our solution is more like a forced amortization over 30 years, but it is that. It's designed such that the problem can't be worse. If it tries to get worse, there are corrective mechanisms built in so that we pay off our unfunded liability over the next 30 years. So what we did in Houston, with the help of the legislature, because it had to go through the legislature, was reduce benefits and then importantly put in a mechanism that keeps the problem from growing like it did in the past. So I think we've got a strong answer there. Now the city will say, not inappropriately, is that they're still resource constrained. We have this limit on revenue in Houston called colloquially the rev cap. There are some who think we should remove the rev cap. What the rev cap does is limit the growth of property tax revenue in Houston to essentially the sum of inflation plus population growth. Some would argue that that's hardly a cap. But others would say, it is constraining. Moody's, the rating agencies, don't like the rev cap. Of course they don't. If you're a rating agency, you don't care what taxes Houstonians pay. What you care about is, does the city have the means to pay its debt? And they don't like the rev cap. But I would say to Houstonians, our credit rating with Moody's is fine. With the pension reform we've put in place, they're even better. And we don't need to remove the rev cap simply to appease the rating agencies. It's a different issue as to whether we think we're getting adequate services from the city and whether we're prepared to pay more for additional services.
Okay, Bob, we have an easy question here for you from your land of Aggies. Okay, why doesn't A&M do the digital engineer conversion from its STEM orientation?
They can and they should and they must. I mean, there's Mike Young, the president of A&M, sits on the partnership board, along with Renu Couture, along with David Lebron. All three of those presidents understand that they need to evolve their STEM programs in this new digital direction. So it's really just a question of pace. And frankly, A&M is the largest of those three in terms of the number of STEM graduates each year. So it's frankly critical that A&M make the transition as much or more as relative to those other two institutions.
Got it. What actions can be taken to improve millennial digital workers? Who will take them? I think you began to touch on that earlier, but maybe you can expand on that.
Well, I'll start with something. This idea of introducing coding to young kids. I mean, I would differentiate, maybe I shouldn't, between playing video games and learning how to code. But we are starting to introduce kids to coding. How do you create the code to solve basic problems? At an earlier and earlier age, just getting kids more acquainted with the digital world. And again, not that I hear plenty of examples of kids that spend a lot of time playing video games and have actually translated that into skill sets that are very relevant today. But rather than bank on that, I would say, hey, start to introduce your children to how do you create code to solve problems. Now, I'll jump all the way to MIT. That's a big leap. They now, instead of requiring their freshmen to read a great book and sit through a seminar course, they require their freshmen to go apply machine learning to a data set to solve some problem out in society. Form a team, pick an issue, and go solve it. And I mean, I think that's the kind of, we're just realizing that we're gonna need to introduce this entire generation to a new method of how issues are dealt with. I was in China in December. The mayor and I and the group went on a typical trade mission. I had been there 3 years earlier, so I kind of had a comparison. On this trip in December, every meeting with every Chinese private sector person or government official talked about artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, how they're transforming their manufacturing systems to be this new age. They bragged about their container terminal, which is akin to our port. They have a fully automated container terminal with no workers on site. Everything's just being done through robotics. And the point is, they get it. And of course, the worry about China is, one thing they can do is they can turn on a dime and then invest in an area. And it was sobering for all of us on the trip to see that and hear that. Now, some of it's always hype in China, so you're hearing more about where they intend to be going than where they are. But it brought home this message.
Well, we're going to have a segment tomorrow on cryptocurrency and blockchain. So if you want to sit in on that, you're invited. I think we're almost out of time, but I can't help but ask the question. How do you feel right now about the Houston Astros, the Rockets, and the Texans, and the ownership of those teams and where we're going? How do you feel good about that?
Well, you got to feel good about that. I'll just remind you, we went from the Final Four in the spring of 16, perhaps the best final of a Final Four, right? Then we had Copa America in Houston a few months later. We had the Super Bowl, what arguably was the best Super Bowl ever.
With Lady Gaga.
Yeah, Lady Gaga, who didn't disappoint.
She was great.
And we had the World Series. I mean, as a lifelong Houstonian, and I pinch myself, who would have thought any one of those things would have happened? We had them all.
So we're not cresting, we're still going up,
we're
right?
We're in good shape. We're in good shape.
So you're feeling good about the Rockets and Tillman? Tillman's going to take that to another place?
No, that's right. So we may be heading back for another championship. So this is an extraordinary time for Houston sports. And you can't, from a quality of life standpoint, from a standpoint of marketing Houston, I think it may have been in this room the other night, we were recognizing Bob McNair, the Texas Sports Hall of Fame, and just reminding ourselves of the decision he made to pursue bringing an NFL team back to Houston and the steps that he took to do that. And it was just a reminder that how could we claim to be a great global city if we were sitting here without all the major sports represented in these teams. So thanks for ending on that positive note, Bill. Thank you. Thank you all. Appreciate the time.
Listen, thank you for being here.